we are really glad and delighted that each of you are here to have this very thought-provoking, very serious discussion around reducing gun violence in the city of Philadelphia. Uh, we've had some really challenging times, particularly over the last year and a half. Philadelphia last year recorded over 500 homicides in the city of Philadelphia. As of March 16th of this year, we have recorded 103 homicides, and that's within 70 some odd days. So the problem still exists, and we're trying to figure out ways of reducing the violence. That's just homicide. Last year, we had roughly 2,200 shootings in the city of Philadelphia. And that's very important that we discuss that. So again, I want to thank you for being here. My name is Darren Tolliver. I am the Associate Director of the African American Resource Center at the University of Pennsylvania. And this conversation is going to be centered around solutions. We're going to focus on solutions. We're going to touch a little bit about the past, but we're looking more about what we can do to stem the tide of violence that's really affecting us, particularly our young kids. And here at Penn, we embrace the community. So this is an event that we feel really strong about in terms of reaching out to the community, seeing what we can do in terms of providing that support and work with city administrations, community stakeholders, and others in order to try to reduce gun violence. In order to do that, I had to bring in somebody who I thought was very, very knowledgeable about laws, about theories, about strategies. And today we have as our special guest, and I really appreciate him for even taking the time to be with us, former DA Seth Williams. And Seth, let me just tell you a little bit about Seth. Seth Williams, he's from Philadelphia. He's from West Philadelphia. He's one of us. He's from West Philadelphia. He went to Central High School. I don't know the graduating number, but I'm sure he'll tell us. He went to Central High School. And he also, he attended Penn State University. And after Penn State University, he went to Georgetown University, where he obtained his law degree. And he was the first African-American DA in the city of Philadelphia and in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And I think that is very, very important that we mention that. So for that being said, I want to bring him on, our brother Seth Williams. Welcome, and welcome.
Well, again, thank you very much, Brother Tolliver, for inviting me, and for the men of Penn for having me as part of this, I think, very important discussion for us to talk about solutions.
Correct.
I don't want to just talk about pointing fingers at who's to blame. I mean, that is necessary, but I hope that we can talk more about solutions and how all of us can be a part of solutions. So you're right. I am a lifelong resident of Philadelphia. I had the honor of being adopted into a family that lived in Cobbs Creek. And I say that because it's important, I think, for me to, as we talk about gun violence reduction strategies. My father, Rufus Williams, was a school teacher. He taught at Sulzberger Junior High School. Every night he worked at the recreation center, the Cobbs Creek Recreation Center, which is at 63rd and Spruce, from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., coaching basketball, playing ping pong with kids, doing arts and crafts. Movie night was on Mondays. And every summer he was a day camp director for Fairmount Park. And I tell people, and I say that because I recognize that despite me having been the district attorney and an assistant district attorney for 10.5 years, a DA for 7.5 years, I recognize that my father did much more than I'll ever do to prevent crime. And so we have to understand, if we're going to talk about gun violence, I believe we have to understand the statistics, the facts. Too often people just throw out things and anecdotes.
Yeah.
But most important, I believe, if we're going to address the root causes and preventing gun violence, we have to understand the facts. Now, I didn't understand all of that for the longest time, but I grew up in Cobbs Creek, as I mentioned earlier. And when I was a very young boy, there was a tragedy. Sergeant Frank Von Collin, who had been a friend of my father, he was a police officer that worked in the park guard house at the bottom of the hill at 63rd and Spruce. And in the summer of 1970, August, some men that believed in some Black nationalist theories came in there and they shot and killed Sergeant Von Collin while he had his back to the door. That led to the police, in my opinion, overreacting and brutalizing a lot of African-American men that lived in my neighborhood. And so I grew up with that dichotomy of wanting to fight for victims, but also wanting to ensure that the criminal justice system is fair for everyone. I think today in 2021, often, and as a result of what we saw in the summer of 2020, I think people perceive that there has to be a choice between public safety and making the criminal justice system equitable and fair, racially and economically, for those that have systemically been prejudiced by the system, right? And I think that's a false choice. We can create a system that prevents crime, that is fair racially and economically, and we have to do both of those things at the same time.
Let me ask you a question, and I'm glad that you started off prefacing a homicide that happened when you were a young boy. Right. These numbers that we're at today, last year we were at 500, 499 officially, and that's the statistic from the Philadelphia Police's crime data that's listed, 499, and that has been equal or just about near the last time the highest was at that point, was in 1990.
Correct.
And I know at 1990, for me, I knew how the circumstances were a little different back then. Crack cocaine really was at the center of a lot of the homicides, drug dealing, drug using, things like that. Fortunately, as far as African Americans, we caught the rough end of that in terms of the system. But as far as homicides are concerned, now we're moving fast forward into 2020, 2021. So my question to you is, what do you think, just as some of the antecedents, some of the circumstances that are leading these numbers to be increasingly high?
Right. And I appreciate that. And what I was going to try to get to was that we have to understand who's being shot, right? And we have to look at the statistics, because it's one thing to say, as you mentioned, year to date, we've had 409 shootings in Philadelphia. And of those shootings, we have more than 100, I believe it's 102 now, are homicides okay?
Yeah.
So that's important. We would have many more homicides in Philadelphia if it wasn't for the phenomenal work done by the trauma centers at Temple, at Penn, at Einstein, okay? But what we have to recognize, if we're going to address the gun violence, is that we have to treat it holistically. We can't just arrest our way out of crime. We just can't perceive gun violence as a law enforcement problem only. We need to treat it as a public health crisis. Mm-hmm. And so that's a lot. And that's really kind of what I wanted to open up with. But I think what's important for us to recognize, if we were to delve and dive deep into the statistics and actually look at who's being shot, recognizing and finding out why they're being shot, right? Then we can address how to prevent it. And I think that's very important, because it's too easy just to say, lock up everybody who does the shooting. I think the Tolliver family would much prefer that Darren wasn't shot. Not that he was shot, the police arrest the person and the district attorney or the U.S. attorney prosecute. The goal is to reduce shooting. And right. So I think that is where we need to start. And we can begin understanding that by looking at, as you said, the antecedents, understanding, well, why are people being shot? And again, I came by this, I was, as you mentioned, I was an assistant district attorney in Philadelphia from September the 8th of 1992 until Valentine's Day of 2003. But in the very beginning, I was just, as every other DA, doing preliminary hearings for felonies, misdemeanor trials. I had a year in juvenile court. where 6 months there, I prosecuted adults that were alleged to have committed crimes against children, the majority of those being sexual assaults. I was in the felony waiver unit for 2 years. Then I was in major trials. I was doing all these trials. I was never really thinking about, well, what's causing the crime? How can we prevent the crime? I was just I was almost an automaton, just doing my part on the conveyor belt of the criminal justice system. Amazingly, it really wasn't until I began teaching. I began teaching at Penn State's Abington campus so that I could help supplement my family income, all right, after I got married.
Right.
And I was teaching criminal justice, the administration of justice, criminology classes. And it was then, as I was preparing and reading my textbook, that I started learning about causation theories of crime. Okay, which I'm sure many of your highly intelligent students at Penn learned much sooner than I did, right? But if you were to think of the movie Trading Places, right, with Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd, and the idea of, well, who commits crime and why? And what can you do to people's lives that changes their lives, that either bring them out of a life of criminality or force them into a life of criminality, right?
Right.
And so it was, we've had different theories, causation theories of crime from the beginning of time when we started thinking about who commits crime. It used to be, we thought people with big heads that were more like Neanderthals, that they committed crimes.
Right.
We thought people were demonic, that they had devils in them that made them commit crimes, right? We progressed through time to see why people commit crime. What's important, I believe, for us to understand is, now who's committing crime?
And that's what I wanted to say. I really want, because you really said something. You said the who.
Right.
And that's important. The who is important, but more importantly, it's the why. Let's say now, as I prefaced in 1990, I kind of gave a foundation of what happened back then and some of the circumstances going on that led to those high numbers. But now, as it relates to 2020, 2021, what do you believe are some of the reasons? And we're not going to stay on this because, again, this is about solutions, but we have to, at the at most, address the why before we move on, right?
And so, if you don't mind, Darren, let me just ask your audience, right? Just trying to engage them. What do people think is the number one reason for shootings? Why are people being shot? What do people, off the top of your head, what do you think are the reasons?
Well, I'll mention it. And, you have a lot of people who would say it's, poverty. A lot of people would say it's, socioeconomic conditions. You'll have a lot of people who often say it's, someone says poverty drives crime. I will also add that education plays a pivotal role.
Fear is also in the chat. So people are putting things in there that I think you should read.
Good.
Yes, thank you for that. We have lack of education, lack of communication skills. Somebody said powerlessness.
Okay.
The inability to regulate their emotions and handle conflict in a healthy way. Thank you very much, Brother Eric, from the Mayor's Commission for African American Males.
Good. Yeah. So I think all of those are a part of it. I think if you were to ask the average person just randomly, what's causing the gun violence?
Somebody said drugs.
People would, right. So the first thing people would think is that people are shooting people like in a bad Steven Seagal movie from the 90s where you have rival drug gangs and people shoot each other. So that's what people think. That's not the reality. People also think that random people are being shot. That's not the reality of the statistics. That's not what it shows. People think that random people are being robbed at gunpoint and shot. That's a very, very, very small percentage. The majority of the people are people that do have access, too easily do they have access to handguns, and then there's a conflict between people. And that leads to known people shooting known people, right? Either family members or just in our circumstance in Philadelphia, young Black and brown men shooting specifically other young Black and brown men that they feel disrespected by. So the number one is an argument caused by some perceived disrespect. So again, I think it's important, Darren, to understand at the macro level, right? Between nations, we have wars primarily because of a disrespect. You can break it down to that. At the micro level, man on man, it comes down to a disrespect. And I came to learn that both as a professor, as the DA, as a kid who rode SEPTA, right, to get to Central, and as an inmate in a federal prison. The majority of arguments have nothing to do with what you would think. It's over somebody turned a channel on TV, right? If somebody stepped on somebody's butters, their Timbs at the SEPTA stop. Somebody fouled somebody too hard on the basketball court, right? You know, someone said that something about someone's family member. These are the types of things that all of the suggestions that the audience had are accurate, right? And so we need to recognize that if we're going to talk about solutions, we have to understand the whys. Because if we don't know the whys of why people are being shot, you can't really affect the solution. Because if you think everybody's being shot because of a gunpoint robbery and people are being shot, or that it was rival drug dealers shooting each other over the fact that they're over some sort of commerce, you'd be wrong. So if that is what we have to understand, then we have to do all that we can also to prevent it. And how are we going to do that? Go ahead.
I'm going to mention a point. Ego, and that was Ashley, she mentioned ego, and I think that's really true. And that's what you just described. I'm gonna mention something that wasn't mentioned, and that's currently that we're in right now, which is this pandemic. You started off by saying that this is a public health issue. The city has acknowledged that as such. The mayor has acknowledged that. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention COVID and how much of that being a part of this rise and gun violence. And the second part to that is the culture of gangs that we're starting to see in Philadelphia that is mimicking places like Chicago, where music is involved in it and things like that. So to those 2 points, how would you answer those?
I would say that, yes, there has been a spike in gun violence during the pandemic. And we could go in people who are much smarter than I am with, PhDs in psychotherapy and psychology, sociology can understand that. So that is true, but the rise and the rate of increase in gun violence and homicides in Philadelphia outpaces all those other places. We have more homicides in Philadelphia than in Chicago, a city
per capita,
much larger. They have more than 3 million people. We have about 1.5 million. And so, again, what's important for me is to talk about statistics and the data, not just anecdotally. But what I would think is important is that I ran for district attorney, and this is just for background, the first time in 2005 against my predecessor. And I ran on the platform of us being smart on crime, not just tough. Later, a famous district attorney of San Francisco, who you might now know her as our vice president, Kamala Harris, wrote a book called Smart on Crime. And smart on crime means that we have to address the root causes of crime, okay? And so I ran then on community-based prosecution. Crimes occur geographically, okay? What does that, and that's important if we're going to come up with theories to prevent crime. Okay, so in Philadelphia, the same trash or sanitation employees pick up the trash in your neighborhood every week. The police officers patrol the same neighborhoods. They don't just show up at the Roundhouse on Monday and they're told to go to 55th and Pine, and then the next day they go to somewhere in the Northeast. No, they patrol in the same neighborhood to get to understand the patterns of crime, the who, where, when, whys. Okay, that makes them better at what they do. So just my personal standpoint, where I grew up in Cobbs Creek, 63rd Street between Catherine and Webster. When I was a kid, if your car got stolen, everybody knew it was probably the Natividad boys on the 6100 block of Catherine that stole your car. When we were little kids, they stole your Nerf football. When we got older, they stole bicycles. Then they stole cars and had a chop shop. Unfortunately, Ricky is on death row now for a homicide. They've cleaned their act up. They have their own business now. But people, on your block, Mr. Tolliver, if you come home with a bag of groceries and you see somebody on your block coming towards you, you quickly look, friend or foe, oh, that's Pookie. He's a good kid. Or that's Miss Johnson's kids, and I'm gonna hurry get in the house real quick. Right? So we have to understand the who's, the where's, the whys, and the what's to prevent crime. So I community-based prosecution as a method of the district attorney's office working in collaboration with the police and community groups and clergy. That allowed me, in working with Commissioner Ramsey, to create GunStat, which took an idea from New York to use the data to actually do crime mapping to see where the crimes are, where the gun violence is. That allowed us to move to a solution what we took known as focused deterrence from a book written by a professor, Dr. David Kennedy at the John Jay School of Criminal Justice in New York, where if I were to draw for you a Venn diagram, and I see you're at Penn, you got the locust walk behind you, you're a smart guy, you know what a Venn diagram is. I'm sure all the other folks do. A Venn diagram, remember from 7th grade science, if I were to draw a circle of those most likely to be shot and superimpose that with a circle of those most likely to do the shooting, in Philadelphia, the intersection and the union of those two is almost 70%. What does that mean? We can identify those most likely to be shot, most likely to do the shooting, the corners, the intersections, and the time of day.
Yeah.
And what in Philadelphia, the data shows us that the supermajority of those, more than 80%, are African-American young men between the ages of 16 roughly and 27.
I'm glad that you're bringing up data statistics from a quantitative lens. I'm more of a qualitative researcher. So one of the things I like to look at is, as though I'm an ethnographer, is I look at trends, I look at behaviors, I examine how different communities act and different things and ways that they do, right? So one of the reasons why I brought up the concept of gangs is because I see how important and how much of a impression that they make specifically on young individuals, right? And they allow and they continue to perpetuate certain myths, for example, like the no snitching, and what that does, it kind of, it stifles progress. It stifles prevention and intervention methods. So when we mention and when we bring up these kind of conversations about looking at the data and looking at quality, I think you can do both and, because I think it's important. I mean, your numbers are really great and it's right on point. I think we cannot exclude the qualitative piece because there's some really strong narratives about why they believe certain things happen that may not necessarily be contained in the data sets that is being produced. So that's why I say we have to kind of do both. And it starts with just, developing strong listening skills. And I think that is how we branch that, moving forward. So I'm guessing now, I want to talk, you mentioned focus deterrence. So I kind of want to switch now because we really want to know solution. I think everyone on here want to know, what can we do? I know they have things that they can recommend and offer, and we encourage them to put it in the chat. But you, as being a former DA and being very knowledgeable, you can give us some information. I think that from a more, I'm a social worker, a practitioner, that I have different things that I do that I work with kids and work with adults and trying to figure out, what is the next step. So sure. I'm posing that question to you.
Right. So
tell me about some strategies or things that we can do to prevent what's going on right now.
Right. So I think it's important. You were talking about groups. You referred to them as gangs, right? But we are, as humans, very social in nature. We want to be a part of something, right? I wanted, as a young 10-year-old Seth Williams, who still had curly hair, I wanted to be a part of the Cobbs Creek Comets basketball team. They had the best uniforms, okay? And they gave us jackets. Everybody wants to be a part of a team of some form. Now, either they'll be the Bloods and the Crips, or the Cobbs Creek Comets, the Moon Gang, right? You're going to join something. But what's important, if you're talking about solutions again, what we have to do and recognize is that in Philadelphia, people are part of groups. The majority of the gun violence is related to group violence. Okay, it's related to, I'm a member of this group, but the initiating factor is generally some form of disrespect, an argument, and then I get a gun that the group has or someone in the group has access to, and I use that gun to shoot someone that I know. Those are the facts. That's the supermajority of the gun violence. How do we prevent that? What are some things that we need to do? So again, some of the members here put in conflict resolution. One thing that we need to do and recognize, my experience as an assistant DA, the DA, and as a federal inmate, about 8 out of 10 men that I lived with in prison had some significant mental health problem. Now, what do we know about that? We know that up until the 80s, the majority of mental health treatment was provided in community-based treatment centers. That ended under President Reagan. That doesn't mean we stop treating people. It means where. The number one provider of mental health treatment in the United States is the Los Angeles County prison system. Number two is the New York City prison system. Number three is the Cook County or Chicago, Illinois prison system. It's unacceptable to me. So if you're going to ask about solutions, we need to have early identification, early intervention, and then community-based therapeutic treatment for mental health issues, okay? We need to help people get the treatment they need, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th grade, as opposed to waiting for them to act out, get prosecuted, get sent to prison, where they're given the lowest level of quality of mental health treatment, while they're also stigmatized, separated from their family. And now with a felony conviction, it's like an economic death sentence. So again, what does it mean to have a holistic approach? It means that we have to address the root causes across the board and not just treat gun violence as a as a law enforcement problem of waiting for people to act out. But if we care, and again, you and I have been talking, I was in the news recently. I'm very angry because again, if you were to look at who's being shot and killed in Philadelphia, it's young Black and brown men.
Right.
And if you ask me to maintain the status quo and not treat it as a public health problem, not to really address it, right? You're telling me that the lives of young Black and brown men just don't matter enough to actually affect change, real change, to save their lives. It's almost like it's just an acceptable number. And we have to recognize that we have to take responsibility ourselves too, part of the solution.
I'm glad you said that, because that's one of the things, that was actually my next question is, what can the community do?
Right. So the community needs the full spectrum of things need to be done, from ensuring that recreation centers and safe harbors for kids exist during times in which kids need to be at those places. You can't have the rec center open 9 to 5. Kids aren't able to go to the rec center 9 to 5 pre-pandemic, right? You need to have things where kids can go and do things kids want to do in a safe way during times that they have access, right? We need to, someone talked about here, we need to have conflict resolution skills in healthy ways. Again, my dad said he taught kids more at the rec center and at the day camp than in school, because kids weren't thinking they're being taught. If you through games and through play, right, you learn a lot more, right? John Chaney taught his players how to be men by coaching them basketball and the little talks that he gave them, right? So the community needs to talk about responsibility, us looking out for each other. We need to do those things through the churches, through town watch, civic associations, engaging kids in real ways, job training, literacy,
Yeah.
You know, all these things are a part of it. But again, it comes down to the majority, again, of the violence being the result of disrespect. So we have to teach young Black men, young brown men, how to, in a healthy way, deal with when you feel disrespected.
And a lot of this comes around the umbrella of, as you mentioned, mental health. You know, a lot of these young individuals, you know, I've actually experienced it myself growing up. Now that I'm able to look back at certain situations, you know, post-traumatic stress is real, you know, and we have to acknowledge that that can actually, you know, force a person or, you know, influence them enough to do certain things that they wouldn't normally do, right? Because they haven't had an outlet to express, you know, how they feel about what they've witnessed, what
Right.
they were involved in, right?
Right.
So
Right.
it's going to take, for that to happen, I think it's going to take more of a larger, broader approach from city officials, which leads to my next question. You know, what do you think?
Aaron, before you ask your next question, there are a lot of comments in the chat that are asking about your comment about most mental health treatment is happening in prisons, and comments about having more mental health and counseling professionals
Yes.
in schools. And
Yes.
Just wondering, what are your thoughts about?
So, and I'm very thankful. You know, I need to update my prescription for my bifocal, so I can't read that in real time.
I don't expect you to read it. That's why I'm here.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Allen.
Yeah. So I think it's very important that we recognize that we need to have early identification and early intervention and public health, mental health treatment, community-based, right? And that is a function that I think is very, very important. But all too often, we just don't have it. And we have to remove the stigma of it. And, you know, you were just talking, Darren, about people having PTSD. We really have to talk with young men about it's okay to talk about how you feel. Right. With each other, having small groups, even if it's just young brothers talking, but they respect, right? Like in prison, they respect the OG, right? And so those men, man, taught so much to other. So I never saw so much respect as in when I was in prison. Yeah. We need to kind of bring that, you know, we need the people in the community to, in addition to there being governmental methods and solutions, we need community-based people. Just, if we're going to, President Obama used to say that we have to be the ones we've been waiting for, right? If there's going to be a solution to gun violence at 63rd and Catherine, it's going to come from people that live around 63rd and Catherine. Yeah. And so those folks there need to engage with one another, not just hide and be afraid, but to actually come out and talk and engage each other and the kids with real solutions there. And just a lot of it is just having a mentor, somebody thinking somebody cares. Too many young men think nobody gives a damn about me, so it doesn't matter. And they don't understand the concept of not using a permanent solution for a temporary problem.
Yes.
So I think that is critical, but that only comes through wisdom. And so we have too many of our men aren't in the community for all types of reasons. And that has hurt us significantly. So it behooves all of us that are to do all that we can every day to be mentors in one way or the other. That could be just coaching. It could be being a volunteer. It means just talking to the brother who's standing at 33rd and Ridge with you, waiting for the 61 and just giving some good knowledge for the 5 minutes y'all waiting for the bus to show up.
One of the things I want to mention is a practice that I found very beneficial. We used it within the Penn community is the concept of healing spaces, healing circles. And I think that we need to do that more. I know the city did that a few times with workers after George Floyd and a few things like that. But it gives them an opportunity to be able to express how they feel, right, without being judged, without having someone go from 0 to 100. Correct. Right. And then, take it to that next level, which we don't want. Whereas the communication, someone mentioned the communication piece. Right. I want to ask you something. I want to push it a little bit because you gave us some community recommendations and I appreciate that. I'm pretty sure our listeners everyone appreciate that as well. I want to ask you, what is the responsibility of city officials, whether it's your former office in the DA's office, whether it's the courts of common pleas and courts, whether it's the mayor's office? We need to know what their responsibility is in terms of addressing and coming up with tangible solutions, not just solutions. We've had solutions for a number of years with certain things that a lot of them didn't work. A lot of money invested that didn't work. So we really need a tangible solutions coming from the hierarchy. And my question to you is, do we have that? I know the city has some things, and I'll talk about that. I'll post it in the chat. But to hear from you, their responsibility.
Well, I mean, there's so many different ways to answer that. I think that the government should reflect, it should be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. That's what it should be. It shouldn't be a separate and distinct, this is a big floating thing that is the government and here are the people. It should be that people represent us, that are part of the community. They do that work and then they come back out, and it has to be a fluid working relationship between the citizens and those that are trying to provide services to the citizens, right? But I do know that the things that I created with Commissioner Ramsey, community-based prosecution, gun stat, and then focused deterrence, we had significant homicide and gun violent rates in the 60s, and 67 was one of the highest. But Philadelphia had a population of about 2 million then. We're down to about 1.5 now. We had the lowest rates of gun violence around 2011. It went down 2012, down 2013, down 2014, began to plateau. And now it's going back up. And I think we have to see what's changed. And I do know that community-based prosecution was ended by the current administration. There appears to be no real working relationship between police, prosecutors, and community as it had been. That's a significant change. They ended focused deterrence.
Right. I
do recognize that Ms. Erica Atwood has a lot of responsibility, and she's trying to, with the work of
the gun violence initiative.
Correct. And yes, with working with Mr. Brian Lentz, who was in charge of my focused deterrence effort, or have renamed it or something, which is necessary. And so I applaud them. I want them to be successful. I want all these people to be successful. So don't think I'm saying anything that I wish bad on anybody, because I want, the young folks to be safe, right? Yeah. But the reality is that we no longer have community-based prosecution. We no longer have gun stat. We no longer use focused deterrence. And there appears to be no working relationship really as a consumer, as a person who just watches TV. I'm no longer in those meetings, but it just seems like there has been a total breakdown of a working relationship between the DA's office, federal authorities, the DA's office, and local law enforcement. And so I think that is a significant part of it. But, as a result of there not being recreation centers now because of the pandemic, or kids being able to go to the library, or kids having a lot of those other things that were parts of the solution. I believe those are also reasons why we see an increase in gun violence right now. But again, at the very onset, I talked about we have to treat it as a public health crisis. And there are people like my friend Scott Charles, who works at Temple, who can talk about this, Jim McMillan, people who always talk about what that means and thinking of it as a public health crisis. Because as we see with a pandemic, right, some sort of epidemic, there's a virus, it spreads. The same with gun violence. It's that, Pookie is mad. I'll use that name, right? Because of something that man did. And then there's a retaliation, and it spreads just like the virus of, right, the scarlet fever, if you will, or now COVID-19. And so treating these things as a public health crisis, one, we attempt to address the root causes, right? Inoculation, prevention on the front end. And then we track in real time, because the police, through their data analysis unit, can do a very good job of analyzing where the crime is, who did what, why, using all that intelligence, as it were, right? to track who's doing what and why. And a lot of it is due to social media. And we can follow that now. Kids having beefs over Instagram, over somebody said something about somebody, what they were wearing at the mall, right? Or whatever. Just and so we have to understand that. And things change, but again, as much as things change, they stay the same.
The same. You mentioned, you mentioned Moon Gang and different gang. Things have changed over the time, but it's still the same thing. It's not like we're new to it. People are so, are used to using new words. They're steppers, or there are, they got ops and all these different things. And I know these different types of language because I want to be able to communicate effectively with them when I talk to them. And it's a way of saying, I understand and I'm listening to you, right? And I think that's very important because the communication, I think, between the generations, there's this, I think it's a gap. I think a lot of times we hear, when things happen, people come out and, they're preaching to the choir in a sense. Right. How can we involve more young people in discussions like these, in discussions in the community, to be able to sit down and have a dialogue without being judgmental and being fair, just to listen instead of trying to tell them.
Okay.
After you answer that, one after you answer that, there are some really important comments in the chat that I'd like to get response to.
Okay. So I'll try to answer mine briefly so we can get to the responses. I recognize that it's more important for there to be a back and forth between all of us. Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
But my answer to that specifically is that we need to engage those most affected by the gun violence in the solution. We have to empower young folks to be a part of the solution, okay? And that starts in our families, okay? So what did I learn both professionally as an assistant DA and then as the DA and tracking these things? That in many ways, the most important person to a young man, the person who's most likely to do the shooting, right, or being shot, he's influenced by other young men his age, more than he is in many ways by his mom, his grandma. But he's even more motivated by young women his age. Let that settle in your head. You think about it, okay? So I would tell my daughters, right, that if they want the boys around them to act right, they got to make them act right. Yes. Right? So what does that mean? If some of the boys are going to do things that we know are kind of illegal, right, to supplement their income, then it behooves the young ladies not to take money from them to get their nails done if they know it's coming from something illegal. And not to disrespect the one dude that's trying to do the right thing, who's got the minimum wage job at Popeyes. Yeah, he's wearing a corny outfit while he's standing on the bus stop, but he's not out there slinging a rock. And to the boy who is slinging a rock, maybe the young woman could talk to him. You know what? You're a smart businessman. You're good at math. But did you know, for the dude who's making the most likely to get shot, the kid on the corner slinging a rock, and he's most likely to get arrested by the feds and the locals, right? He's only making about $8 an hour slinging a rock. Mm-hmm. He would actually make more money. The young woman told him, hey, you'd make more money if you went to ShopRite and you bought a case of water, 24 bottles, and sold each bottle for $1. You'd make more money.
Yeah.
And you know, if we do that, then maybe I'll let you take me to the movie. Okay, then his whole head changes. And maybe he's not going to be out there doing other things. Just a thought that all of us have responsibility, but specifically, we have to engage young folks, right? Because what I learned, both as a DA and as a federal inmate, is that you get more change is made by people policing themselves and their own group than by having authority tell them what to do.
Okay. All right. We do have a question. We have a couple questions in the chat. Let's just say, let's see what we have here.
So one of the comments that is up earlier is that while there needs to be a multi-pronged approach, it's also critical to acknowledge that the power structure does not value Black and Brown lives. this is deeply felt by our young people who see their elders being disrespected and then decide they have to use violence to get respect. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, again, that is all tragically true. And again, like I said from the very onset, people don't think of it, but the majority of wars at the macro level and the majority of homicides, right, the micro level, are the feeling of disrespect, the perception of disrespect. And so we really, if we're going to change that, we really have to talk to folks. We have to change the course, the arc of how they receive that information, right? How they respond to it. We also, quite honestly, have to change the availability of handguns. We have to address the availability. We have to address.
We lost you, Seth. Yeah. Darren, say something so I know that I can hear you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but okay.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I said we have to also address and hold accountable the people that profit off of the bloodshed in the neighborhood, the people that are selling the guns illegally, the people that are renting the guns illegally, the girlfriends and the aunties that are buying straw purchasing guns for folks. We have to address all of those things. That is what I mean by a holistic approach.
Yes.
It's not one thing. There's no, I'm sorry for the pun. There's no one silver bullet that's going to, we have to address all these things, but not in the silos of, you know, the library. We have to have a holistic and a cohesive method of coordinating all of these things. And currently we do not.
You mentioned the availability of guns. That's one of the things that have, for me, has been really important, because I do know that the city is really kind of behind the 8 ball. And it's not because of they're not trying. It's because gun laws are set by state officials, state legislature, and all of that. That's up Harrisburg, right? And it makes it difficult for our elected officials to work on or establish a policy about guns in Philly when we don't have that control. There was a situation, you mentioned straw purchasing, situation last year in West Philadelphia. Young man went to 8 different counties, purchased 36 weapons, right? 36 weapons. He got caught committing a robbery out in Montgomery County, Westchester, I believe, right? When he was arrested, the cops asked him, where are the other 35 guns that you purchased? Right. So my question is, how do we close that? You mentioned loopholes. How that, one, in 2020, that still exists? And 2, why aren't there communication between different counties about the number of guns being purchased? Because as you can see, and we have, a police officer that's going to come on later, hopefully, who's going to talk about the type of guns that are in the streets now. These are high-powered weapons that we're talking about. We're not talking about like 38 specials, right? So we have to figure out how they're getting to the streets, and maybe you can give us some insight on that.
Right. And so again, there are different realities as to limitations and the separation of powers between federal government, state, local. We can't allow that frustration to make us just throw our hands up in the air. But I will say that I was frustrated as the district attorney in trying to make some changes that I thought would reduce the gun violence in the city because of the NRA's strong hold on lawmakers in Harrisburg in preventing even what I thought were laws that everybody could agree on. Here's an example. You mentioned a guy who bought 30-some guns. When he gets arrested, they're asking, well, where are the other ones? So, well, I don't know. Okay, well, what happens often is that people purchase the guns. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Something popped up on my screen. Is that people purchase guns and then they sell them, right? So what happens is, but when they get caught about it, in Pennsylvania, there is no law that you have to report your gun lost or stolen. That would significantly, as we've seen in other states, significantly reduce the number of guns that are in the flow of commerce. But we have over, I think somebody said close to 400 million handguns and weapons in America right now. So even if we stop selling them today, we still have it's just an amazing number. But realistic laws in Pennsylvania, if your car is stolen or lost, you have to report it. I think it makes sense. It's a sensible law that lawmakers in Harrisburg should pass, that you have to report your gun lost or stolen. That would eliminate, at least in the future, the potential for a person to purchase the gun legally and then sell it illegally for a great profit, which is then later used on the street to kill someone. So that is a legitimate method that I think would significantly reduce some of the gun violence. But again, that's just a small fraction. We have to do all that we can. Now we have ghost drugs. We have people that are creating the guns, illegally. We have to address that.
Can you tell us what ghost guns is? Because a lot of people are kind of, and I'm being one of them, to be honest. But tell us exactly what are ghost guns.
Yeah, well, again, I'm still kind of new to learning that myself. I know Captain Gillespie of the 18th Police District, who I speak to almost daily. I think he has accepted your invitation. He's going to be on here. I feel more comfortable allowing him to define it. But I believe ghost guns are those, you can almost order the parts, like 80% of the parts, right? And you can kind of create it yourself, and they don't have a serial number. And that's just part of it. That's a very, very layman's explanation of what a ghost gun is, and that it's not purchased at a gun store. You can purchase them, the kits, if you will, through, at these pop-up gun conventions almost, you know what I mean? And so I think that is a very rudimentary understanding and explanation of what ghost guns are. Most people think, that you go to a gun store. The majority of guns in Philadelphia that are used in gun violence, however, are purchased through straw purchasers. For the longest time, most of the guns in West Philly, if they weren't purchased through a straw purchaser, were purchased at a pawn shop on 69th Street, Lou's Pawn Shop, okay? Also, a significant number are either kept by a group, right? So the gang has access to guns, and a couple members in the group have them somewhere stashed at a stash house, trap house, right? Or what happens also, as crazy as it might sound, there are places you can go in Philly just to rent a gun. So
wow. You said to rent a gun?
Yeah, so it used to be, you could go to the Hideaway Lounge, which was at 63rd and Catherine, and you could rent a gun. I mean, they kept them there. You talked to the right person. They gave it to you. You gave them some money. You went and did your robbery or whatever it was, and you brought it back.
Wow.
If you did something too hot with it, it got thrown in Cobb's Creek. And then you had to pay a higher rate, basically, for non-returning the weapon, right? The Hideaway is closed now. It changed names, became something else. But that's just an example of people know how to get guns. It's not a secret. If you talk to kids on the street, young men, if they wanted one, they would know exactly where to go and how to get one. So we have to hold accountable, right? A holistic approach means we do all we can on the prevention side, and that we, in a much more thorough way, hold those accountable that are profiting off of bloodshed and those that are hurting people, bringing harm to the community. And we have to do all that we can to heal victims. By helping victims heal, that can also help prevent the cycle of that violence continuing.
There's a comment in the chat that said, speaking of family, can you provide insights about how your father played a key role in shaping you as a man? And I want to expand that and say not just a father, but a male role model.
Yeah, so I don't know if that was a person who actually knew my father, but I was just incredibly blessed by God to have been adopted by Rufus and Imelda Williams,
Yeah.
um, and my father was the son of an AME minister. My dad didn't drink, he didn't curse, he didn't smoke, but he married a Creole girl from Galveston, Texas, that did all three of those things often and well. But they were the perfect yin and the yang to each other. But my father was a school teacher and he worked at the rec center and the day camp, as I've mentioned, and was a father figure to so many kids and specifically young men, coaching the basketball team, coaching the Cobbs Creek Mohawks back in the 50s and 60s. All those things were an example to me of one, how to treat people. Wherever we were, if we were at Sears, I used to be at Sears. I'm showing my age again. Used to be
Yeah,
at
man.
Sears,
63rd Market.
63rd Market. We go to Sears.
Yes.
Everybody knew him, who my dad was, and would talk to him. I thought he was like the king of something. The way everybody just treated him, and that was because both the parents and the kids and multiple generations knew him. So that's true in every neighborhood. The people who are the coaches, they're treated, because people recognize that they're doing something to give back, they're helping. And my father, while he had a comfortable, lifestyle and his finances, he wasn't a rich man monetarily, but he was probably the richest person I knew spiritually
Yeah.
because of what he was doing and how he was doing it. And I told people, I wanted, as a result of, I went to Central High School in the 80s, I thought I looked like the lost DeBarge brother. I wanted to be famous. And that led me on a different track, right? I wanted to be the lawyer. I want to do this. I used to tell people later on, if I had to do it all over again, I would be a high school history teacher and coach the football team in the fall, coach the track team in the spring, work at a rec center, just like my dad. And so now what am I going to do? I was just recently hired to be the director of a vocational training center in Philadelphia because
Congratulations on your hiring.
I recognize that if we're going to really prevent crime, and this gets back to the other issues you were talking about, we have to get people jobs. We have to give them job readiness skills. We have to teach them self-pride, right? I taught GED for more than 2 years while I was in prison. And what I learned from that experience was the majority of the men that I taught, they never had a problem getting a job. They had problems keeping jobs.
Mhm.
They didn't have the conflict resolution skills.
Yeah.
They didn't know to show up on time. They didn't know about don't get another tattoo over your forehead or your eyelids. Having the eyelid tattoos that say don't sleep might be a problem during a job interview. Let me talk to you about showing up on time. Let's call everybody in Mr. and Mrs. Right? What is that respect? You want respect? You're going to have to give respect.
That's right.
And that's something I learned in prison. That was the most respectful place I was ever at. People make sure you walk in front of somebody in the TV room. Hey, excuse me, my brother. And I'm going, everybody is saying, being respectful about everything. So we have to mimic that in the community. And so again, I was very fortunate. My dad was my best friend.
Yeah.
He was my best man when I got married. My life hasn't been the same since he passed,
Yeah.
but all of us need that role model. And whoever that role model is, if it can't be our natural father or an adoptive father, we need mentors, coaches, teachers, friends, pastor. We need all of those people. And kids gravitate to those people who they see are leaders, who care about them. All of us want to be cared about. That's the number one thing.
Yeah, I agree.
We want people to say, how are you? We want people to know, hey, I care about you, Darren. How you doing?
Mhm.
Let's talk about that. Right?
Yeah.
Man, that means a lot to a kid. And you give them like I said, I was on the Cobbs Creek Commerce. We had the baddest jackets. Everybody want to be a part of the team. Doesn't cost a whole lot of money.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? But
Yeah.
doing those types of things, and it's through those ways that you learn how to interact with other people by being on a team, right? And so again, being responsible to members of your cohort group is something that people need to learn.
Yeah.
And they're going to learn it either by from the wrong people, right? Or we can try to create more ways for them to learn about it from the right people.
Okay. I'm gonna ask this question, and then after you answer this question, I'm gonna go to we're gonna go to the chat, and feel free to ask a question. And if we could, if time allows us, we can get in and he can answer. The mayor has a 5-year strategy, a gun reduction strategy. Yeah, it's the Philadelphia Roadmap for Safer Communities. I'll post it in the chat, and I think that it would be great if we can get people to really, look at it and really understand. I mean, it focuses on prevention, intervention, it has enforcement. And one of the things that we don't really talk about that's happening more is the concept of recidivism and reentry.
Right.
Men who are coming back into reentrance, coming back into, as former Mayor Good would say, reentrance, coming back into the city and being a productive citizen in society.
Right.
So tell me about that plan in terms of if you've looked at it, and because I've looked at it and I see it's a very ambitious plan, and I do see a lot of promise in it. I just wanted your feedback on it, and I'll post it in the chat. So if anyone wants to look at the plan, they can have a copy of it for themselves.
Right. And so again, I will say that I haven't seen this plan specifically. I know that we have lots of reiterations of these plans. I do know that being the mayor is one of just an extremely difficult job, and you end up making a lot of enemies. I recognize that. I can say that I had a very personal relationship with Councilman Jim Kenney and then Mayor Jim Kenney, and we were very good friends. I know that his heart is in the right place and that he cares and wants to do the right thing. I know that often government.
Hold on, Seth. Can you hear me? We lost you for a second. Can you hear him? Val?
I'm back.
For me, because I'm on mute.
You're back. You're back. Go ahead, Seth. I'm sorry. Right.
I don't know how much of you where you I got cut off because of.
You were talking about your relationship with the mayor.
Right. So I would say that often governmental structures get in the way of good people trying to do good things. Okay. But I will say that as it relates to reentry, there's so many barriers. You would think that once people go away and are held accountable, they do their time, they're going to let them come home and just start over. That's not the truth, man. It's not the reality. And that we have barriers, and that I'm very thankful State Senator Shirley Kitchen worked very hard to remove a lot of the laws that were barriers. But it used to be in Pennsylvania, you couldn't get a job cleaning toilets in a nursing home if you had a felony conviction. So just think about that. You do 10 years of Graterford, you come home, you're trying to get a legitimate job, and they're not going to let you even clean